Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really um, a heavy topic, but one that feels incredibly relevant right now.
It definitely does.
You look around the world and you kind of hear these echoes of past instability, like those really rough years between the world wars that, well, ended in global conflict. Our source for today suggests we might be in a similarly troubling era.
That's the core premise, yeah. It's unsettling. We're drawing from excerpts of Martin Wolf's book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism.
A pretty significant work.
Absolutely. And the central question he asks, and the one we're exploring today, is stark. Can democratic capitalism as we know it actually survive the challenges it's facing?
That's a huge question. So our mission here is to really dig into these excerpts, pull out the main arguments Wolf makes, try to identify the big forces he sees at play.
And sort of extract the key insights for you, the listener.
Okay, so where do we start?
Well, Wolf kicks off by pointing out this really interesting kind of fundamental connection between democracy and the market economy. The idea of equality of status, at least in theory, right? In the market, everyone has an equal right to buy and sell. And in a democracy, every citizen, again, in theory, has an equal voice.
And the source points out that historically, these market economies, especially when the government stepped in to help, actually helped bring about more political inclusion.
Exactly. It wasn't automatic, but it sort of paved the way for something pretty new in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
Universal adult suffrage.
Right. But the core argument now from Wolf is that this balance, this relationship between the market and democracy, it's unstable.
Deeply unstable. He argues pretty strongly that significant changes are needed if those core Western values, freedom, democracy, Enlightenment ideals, are going to stick around.
Okay, unstable. Let's unpack that. It's easy to take our current system for granted, but this idea of universal representative liberal democracy, it's actually incredibly recent, isn't it?
Oh, remarkably so. Wolf calls it a political mayfly. I mean, think about the dates he gives. New Zealand, often seen as a trailblazer, gave suffrage to all adults, women included, only in 1893.
In the U.S.
Well, for African Americans across the South, truly securing the vote wasn't until 1965. And Switzerland, you would guess this.
Yeah.
Federal suffrage for women only came in 1971, and one canton held out until 1990.
Wow. Okay, so not exactly ancient history.
Not at all. This full form is very young.
And this links back to how politics and economics have always been intertwined, but the way they're linked has changed a lot.
Right. We went from these pre-modern states, which the source describes as often being like the ruler's personal property.
Patrimonial states, I think is the term.
Exactly. Living off forced labor serfs, slaves. And the source reminds us, slavery was tragically common everywhere, not just a Western thing. These states were incredibly good at concentrating wealth right at the top.
Leaving very little for everyone else.
Just enough to survive, often. The rise of market economies created a different dynamic. It gradually, over a long time, made sharing power more necessary, which eventually led to more political inclusion.
And this is tied into our ability as humans to create what the source calls imagined communities, like nation states.
Yeah, these large groups of people who feel connected, even if they don't know each other personally. That sense of shared identity being part of a demos is actually crucial for democracy to work.
Why is that?
Because you need to trust the people who might outvote you. You need to believe you're fundamentally part of the same community, sharing some core values, so you can accept losing an election without thinking the whole system is illegitimate.
Okay, I see. So alongside this political change, the size and role of government just exploded.
Massively. The source shows government spending as a share of GDP. It just soared after 1870.
Like how much?
Well, in the U.S., for example, it went from around 7% in 1870 to 36% by 2019. And it wasn't slow growth. It jumped during big crises, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II.
Right, as governments took on new roles, education, health, social security.
Exactly. That's when you get the rise of the Keynesian mixed economy.
Then came the pushback, right? The Reagan-Thatcher era in the 80s.
The counter-revolution, yeah, aiming for freer markets. But interestingly, even after that, government stayed pretty big. Wolf notes that in many countries, that growth in state spending kind of leveled off after 1980.
And that move towards freer markets also coincided with a huge surge in globalization.
Definitely. Capitalism always pushes beyond borders, but the period since the 80s, fueled by liberalization, saw this incredible jump in interconnectedness.
And one massive consequence of that has been China's rise.
Oh, absolutely. The numbers are stark. China's share of global GDP at market prices went from just 2% in 1990 to 16% in 2019. a new superpower on the block.
16%.
It's huge, though we should keep perspective. High-income countries together still held about 60% of global GDP share then, and while China exports a ton, its share of global imports was 13%, less than the US and EU combined at 30%.
And the U.S. role.
Still the biggest net borrower in the world, in absolute terms. Quite interesting.
Wolf also points out this strong link, generally speaking, between economic freedom and political freedom. Liberal capitalism and liberal democracy seem to go together.
They tend to, yeah. He mentions a few small exceptions like Hong Kong and Singapore, which he calls sort of benevolent autocracies, but they were constrained by needing foreign investment.
But just as he makes that point, he pivots to the worry.
Exactly. The democratic recession.
Meaning?
Well, basically, the spread of democracy has stalled out. And, maybe more worryingly, the quality of democracy in existing ones seems to be going downhill since around 2006.
The Great Recession didn't help there, I imagine.
It certainly played a role. Maybe not as catastrophic for democracy itself as the Great Depression was, partly because, governments managed the crisis a bit better this time, perhaps.
But it damaged trust.
Hugely eroded confidence in the elites, both political and economic. And this decline isn't just in fragile, newer democracies. It's hitting established ones, too. Wolf explicitly mentions the U.S., once a leader, now seeing its democratic quality diminish.
Okay, so what are the underlying economic currents pushing things this way? Wolf talks about these powerful long-term trends.
Right. One big one is the productivity slowdown.
Meaning we're just not getting efficient as fast.
Kind of.
Hmm.
The argument is, after those massive innovations of the Second Industrial Revolution, electricity, cars, sanitation, all that foundational stuff, the easy gains, the low-hanging fruit are mostly gone. A lot of big shifts, like moving people from farms to cities, you only do once.
And linked to that is growing inequality between regions. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
You get these superstar cities, London, New York, Silicon Valley, that benefit from network effects. The more talent and business that clusters there, the more productive it becomes, creating this strong feedback loop.
While other places get left behind. Deindustrialization.
Exactly. Hollowing out.
Yeah.
The OECD found the productivity gap between the top regions and the rest in rich countries widened by something like 60% over just 2 decades.
That's huge.
It is. And you see signs of this social stress, like declining workforce participation among prime age men, especially in places like the US and Italy. Guys who you'd expect to be working just aren't even looking. That's a sign of real discouragement.
Then there are the big demographic shifts happening globally.
Massive shifts. Huge population growth projected for sub-Saharan Africa. China and India are still the giants, though India is catching up fast. Meanwhile, the high-income countries, their share of the world's population is shrinking.
Which has big economic implications.
Definitely. As developing countries keep growing, the rich world's slice of the global economic pie is likely to get smaller. And those demographic pressures, particularly from Africa towards Europe, probably mean intense migration pressures in the coming decades.
Okay, so you have these long, slow trends, and then, bam, the Great Recession hits, 2007, 2012.
And this wasn't just any crisis. It came from the absolute core of the global financial system, the immediate cause, an explosion of private debt, a lot of it tied to property bubbles, and people borrowing more to consume because, for many, real wages hadn't really grown.
But Wolf digs deeper, right? What were the underlying causes?
He points to things like China joining the world economy, which had complex effects, plus widespread financial liberalization, less regulation, and maybe central banks focusing too much on just inflation, ignoring other risks building up.
And a system itself was vulnerable.
Critically, undercapitalized, underregulated, so the crisis spread like wildfire. But crucially, the public reaction wasn't just about the crash itself, it was about how it was handled.
The bailout.
Exactly. There was this perception of intellectual and moral corruption among the elites. People saw huge amounts of public money used to rescue the very banks and bankers they blamed for the mess.
While ordinary people lost homes, jobs, faced austerity.
Right. Stagnant wages. And adding insult to injury, the feeling was widespread that nobody important really faced any consequences. No jail time, no serious accountability for those who drove the system off the cliff.
That lack of accountability, it feels like a turning point.
A major catalyst, Wolf argues, for the collapse in trust we're still dealing with.
And that leads us to another really key concept in the book, this idea of rigged capitalism, or rentier economy.
Yes, this is central. It's about how market power and political power are being exploited systematically.
How so? Give us an example.
Well, one area is financialization and what he calls rent extraction. The financial sector consistently grabs a huge share of corporate profits. Wolf questions how much of that is actually creating value versus just extracting rent, taking wealth from others without necessarily producing more.
Like banking creating its own fuel through lending.
Exactly. Lending that doesn't always go into productive investment. And even after the crisis, bank profits stayed high, partly thanks to all that government support and super low interest rates.
Okay, what else falls under rigged?
Corporate governance failures. When companies are successful, maybe because they have unique tech or a dominant market position, the extra profits the rents often flow just to shareholders and top executives.
Not the workers or the broader community.
Not necessarily. Wolf points to the problem of shareholder dominance. When shareholders aren't really involved in running the company, they have limited liability, they can sell shares, easily exit, rather than using their voice to push for better long-term governance.
And the managers themselves have incentives to, well, rig the game.
Pretty much, linking pay to short-term stock prices, using company money for share buybacks, which boost the stock price, rather than investing in future growth or workers.
This ties into another point, weak competition.
Right. Wolf cites research suggesting markets, particularly the U.S., have become less competitive. More concentration, dominant firms staying dominant, profits being excessively high because new competitors can't easily challenge them.
And is that just technology, like network effects?
Wolf argues no, not primarily. He says the main explanation is political. Things like regulatory barriers stopping new companies from entering, weak enforcement of antitrust laws, and the huge influence of corporate lobbying and political donations shaping the rules of the game.
Interesting that he contrasts that with the EU.
Yeah, somewhat ironically, he suggests the EU has often been more effective on competition policy recently, partly because integrating the single market required breaking down barriers. Though he does note the U.S. might be shifting back towards stronger enforcement now under Biden.
And the final piece of this rigged puzzle is tax avoidance.
A huge one. Large corporations, wealthy individuals, they benefit massively from the stability and infrastructure of democratic states, but use loopholes and tax havens to avoid paying their fair share.
Which benefits shareholders again, right? Profits taxed slightly, then turn into capital gains, also often lightly taxed.
Exactly. Wolf sees this as profoundly unfair. It undermines the legitimacy of the whole system, the tax system, the market economy itself. He says corporations are essentially fouling their own nests by weakening the very states they rely on. And rich individuals using havens just adds to that sense of unfairness.
So you've got all this economic frustration in the sense the game is rigged. It seems like perfect conditions for political discontent.
Absolutely fertile ground. And Wolf sees populism as, well, almost an inevitable feature in democracies, especially when times are tough.
How does he define populism here?
Populists claim they represent the real people against elites who are portrayed as corrupt, out of touch, maybe even traitorous. And, Wolf acknowledges sometimes a critique of elites is valid, especially after big failures like the financial crisis.
But there are huge danger.
Immense risks. Populist movements often reject expertise, dismiss inconvenient facts. They want to tear down the institutions that constrain power, courts, independent agencies, the free press, because those are run by the elites they despise.
And the end point of that can be
Unchecked power. Tyranny. Wolf even echoes Plato's ancient warning about societies turning to a strongman protector who ends up becoming a despot.
this anti-elite feeling also plays into how politics itself is changing. Wolf mentions Piketty's work.
Right, the Brahmin left versus merchant right idea. It describes a shift where you have this sort of binary elite system emerging. High-income voters often lean right, but high-education voters have increasingly moved left.
Creating the Brahmin left-educated elites may be more focused on cultural issues, identity politics.
And sometimes seen by others as looking down on traditional values or national identity. And then the merchant right appeal to less educated voters, often by attacking that perceived arrogance of the Brahmin elite, calling them unpatriotic, stuff like that.
And Wolf points to a particularly dangerous combination here.
Yes, what he calls Pluto-populism. That's the marriage of wealthy, commercial elite interests with populist appeals, often using identity politics, especially race or ethnicity, to mobilize voters.
He uses a historical example.
A really chilling one. The pre-Civil War American South. Slave-owning planters, who were basically rent-extracting aristocrats, managed to convince poor white farmers to fight and die for the Confederacy, largely by appealing to racial identity and fear.
And he draws a line from that to more modern politics.
He connects it to things like the Southern strategy in U.S. politics, which helps shift the South to the Republican Party, often by exploiting racial tensions. He sees figures like Donald Trump as a kind of endpoint of this, using themes like the deep state, blaming foreigners and minorities for problems, whether through trade rhetoric or immigration.
Brexit gets mentioned in this context, too.
As another example where complex domestic problems were often simplified and blamed on outsiders immigrants, the EU bureaucracy. Though Wolf does note that, say, in the UK case, the populist leaders weren't necessarily attacking pluralism or minority rights directly, but their attitude towards democratic norms and institutions could still be worrying.
And what about the role of social media in all this?
It's a powerful amplifier, no doubt, incredibly effective at spreading populist messages, bypassing traditional media gatekeepers. But Wolf is clear. It's not the cause.
The cause is the underlying discontent.
Exactly. The distress, the fear, the anger, those are the drivers. Big political eruptions happen long before Facebook and Twitter. Think about the 1848 revolutions across Europe, or the Arab Spring more recently.
This widespread disillusionment also seems to feed into critiques of how democracy itself actually works.
It does. Wolf references work, like Aiken and Bartel's Democracy for Realists, which argues voters often aren't making these carefully reasoned choices based on policy.
Instead,
They often rely much more on tribal loyalties, on group identities. Again, racial identity in the U.S. is used as a key example. People vote with their group, almost regardless of specific policies.
it sounds a bit like George Washington's warning about factionalism.
Very much so. The worry that loyalty to your faction, your tribe, could overwhelm commitment to the democratic process itself. And this frustration leads some thinkers to even propose alternatives, like epistocracy, rule by the knowledgeable.
Which sounds problematic. Who decides who's knowledgeable?
Exactly. It raises huge fundamental questions. Whose knowledge counts? Whose interests get served? It's not a simple fix.
And finally, in this section on political challenges, Wolf tackles citizenship and immigration head-on.
Yeah, it's a really crucial point. He argues that if you want a national welfare state, one based on solidarity where citizens agree to pool resources and support each other, well, then citizenship has to mean something. It has to be somewhat exclusive.
You can't extend that deep level of mutual obligation to everyone on the planet.
Realistically, no. He critiques what he sees as errors on both sides. The far right says only your kith and kin, your ethnic group, truly belong. Some on the left seem to want maximum equality within the country, but resist any controls on who comes in.
So what's the alternative?
Wolf argues for the need for controlled immigration.
Yeah.
Policies that are humane, yes, but also politically acceptable to the existing population and seen as fair. And critically, policies that recognize immigrants aren't just workers, they're people who become part of the society and inevitably change it over time.
Okay, so that's a pretty comprehensive diagnosis of the problems: economic, political, social. What about solutions? Where does Wolf see a path forward?
Well, the first big message is reform, not revolution.
Build on what we have, don't tear it all down.
Precisely. He draws on thinkers like Edmund Burke, Karl Popper, arguing that trying to remake society from scratch is incredibly dangerous, usually leads to disaster and tyranny. The better path is what Popper called piecemeal social engineering. Identify specific problems, specific harms, and work to fix them step by step.
And what are the goals of that reform?
He echoes Franklin Roosevelt's famous 4 freedoms, framing the goals as security, opportunity, prosperity, and dignity for citizens. And a big lesson from recent crises, the financial crash, the pandemic, is that we need robust systems. Systems that can actually handle major shocks.
Okay, let's get into specifics. Economic policy.
Macro stability is key. Central banks, governments, they need to be ready to support demand if the economy weakens. But, and this is crucial, they can't overdo it. We saw what happened in 2021 with inflation taking off globally. There's a balance.
He pushes back on some arguments there, doesn't he? Like the idea that recessions are necessary evils.
He does. He dismisses the creative destruction argument when it comes to deep slumps, saying they destroy too much. And he argues against inaction based on worries about, say, making the rich even richer through low interest rates, pointing out that most people have very little wealth and need jobs and stable incomes above all.
What about innovation and investment?
Big role for government here. Markets alone tend to underinvest in basic research and development because the benefits spill over to everyone. They're public goods. Innovation isn't just new gadgets, it's new systems, new relationships, like banking, the internet, maybe future digital public infrastructure.
And infrastructure investment generally.
He sees a big opportunity, especially when real interest rates are so low. It makes borrowing for governments very cheap. Investing in infrastructure provides long-term benefits and isn't usually an ongoing spending commitment like, say, social programs.
How about globalization? Should we reverse it?
No, he argues against deglobalization. Openness has benefits trade, investment, but countries absolutely should regulate these flows for legitimate reasons.
Like protecting the environment or national security.
Exactly, or supporting domestic innovation.
Yeah.
He also makes the point that things like intellectual property rules, while useful, can sometimes block development, especially in areas like public health globally,
And immigration comes up again here.
reiterating the need for managed flows, humane, politically sustainable, effective controls, acknowledging the economic benefits immigrants bring, but also managing the long-term social and demographic changes.
What about jobs, skills, and those regions left behind?
This is critical. We need policies to help people adjust as the job market changes, less manufacturing, more demand for high skills, things like active labor market policies training, job search assistance.
But regenerating those deindustrialized areas is really hard, isn't it?
Incredibly difficult. It requires a coordinated effort, local communities, businesses, maybe specific local investment banks, plus national support. He mentions the Basque Country in Spain as a rare success story there.
Any other tools for helping workers?
He suggests minimum wages can be useful, said carefully. The idea is to counter potential employer power, what economists call monopsony. Evidence from the UK suggests it can raise pay for the low-paid without necessarily costing lots of jobs. Plus, using tax credits to top up low earnings, ensuring work pays a decent living.
And the welfare state itself, how does he view that?
He's a strong defender, but maybe not in the way people usually think about it. He emphasizes its role in redistributing income over a person's own lifetime.
How does that work?
Think of it like a giant piggy bank. You pay in when you're working, you draw out when you're young, education, sick, unemployed, or old. Pension. It provides security against life's risks. He cites a UK study showing most people get back roughly what they put in over their whole lives. It makes almost everyone more secure.
So it's built on a social contract.
Exactly. Fair contributions based on ability, support based on need, universal access to key services.
But areas like education, training, retirement, they need fixing.
Big time. Public education quality varies too much. The U.S. student loan system, he calls it a scandal.
Why specifically?
Just the sheer scale of debt, $1.5 trillion, the inflexibility you usually can't discharge it in bankruptcy like other debts, and the huge racial disparity, he points out. Black students ending up owing more than they borrowed years later, much more often than white students. It cripples opportunity.
And retirement.
The collapse of traditional company pensions defined benefit plans is a huge loss. They were probably too expensive for companies to maintain, creating unfairness between generations and between private and public sector workers. But their disappearance leaves a big hole in retirement security for many.
Okay, let's shift to corporations. What needs to change there?
Fundamentally rethinking their purpose. Moving beyond just maximizing short-term shareholder value. He likes the British Academy's phrase. Businesses should solve the problems of people and planet profitably and not profit from causing problems.
So specific reforms.
A lot focus on harm reduction. Better transparency in accounting, making auditors truly independent. Though he notes creating reliable ESG standards, environmental, social governance is actually quite hard.
And crucially, curbing their political influence.
Yes, this is vital. Corporations should be subject to the rules, not making the rules. Only people are citizens with democratic rights. Lobbying and donations need transparency, maybe severe limits, ideally none. Getting big money out of politics is key.
What about the specific challenges of the digital economy? Algorithms, data.
That needs attention too. Algorithms have huge power over our lives now. Data can be biased. Systems are often designed solely for profit. Wolf argues these need regulation like we regulate food or drugs. We need to know how they work transparency.
And finally, what about government itself?
It needs reform too. Given how much states do now, spending huge shares of GDP, high-quality administration isn't a luxury, it's essential.
Expertise matters.
Hugely. Science can't tell politicians what values to pursue, but politicians need competent advice and effective implementation to achieve any goals. He contrasts how different governments handled COVID often. Populist leaders who disdained expertise did much worse.
That contempt for expertise seems widespread.
He calls it a plague. Conspiracy theories, dismissing expert advice. It makes good government impossible. So, renewing the civil service is crucial. attracting and keeping talented, diverse people. Maybe looking at models like Singapore, which invests heavily in its civil service, versus systems with lots of political appointees.
And money in politics comes up again.
Absolutely. Limiting its influence, including foreign interference and donations, is presented as a prerequisite for restoring faith in democracy. He even floats ideas for structural political reform, like maybe improving legislative bodies, a House of Merit perhaps, to get better laws.
Okay, zooming out again towards the end. Wolf connects the fate of democratic capitalism to bigger global issues.
Right. He sees three things as interconnected and fragile: democratic capitalism itself, the global order it underpins, and the global environment. All three need strengthening, and they affect each other.
And the role of the established democracies.
Even though their share of world population is smaller, high-income democracies still have enormous influence. Their companies, universities, ideas, currencies, the institutions they help build, they still shape the world.
How should they deal with rising powers, especially China?
This is a massive challenge. Wolf sees China as becoming, or potentially becoming, a comprehensive rival to the U.S. He argues trying to contain China like the Soviet Union just isn't realistic. China's too big, too integrated globally.
So what's the approach?
It has to be complex, a mix of competition where interests clash, but also cooperation where interests align, which is essential in areas like climate change or pandemics. And fundamentally aiming for peaceful coexistence. Confrontation will happen, but avoiding military conflict is paramount.
The pandemic really drove home that interconnectedness, didn't it?
Absolutely. A stark lesson. It underscores the need for more global cooperation, not less. Wolf argues we need stronger global governance across a whole range of issues: disease surveillance, climate action, biodiversity, cybersecurity. He points to past successes like the Montreal Protocol on ozone or the Law of the Sea Treaty as models.
And he comes back to the role of elites at the end?
He does. It's a recurring theme. Societies need elites, people with influence, expertise. But the kind of elite matters enormously. Predatory, short-sighted, self-serving elites, they destroy societies from within. He gives historical examples like the late Roman Republic and expresses concern about trends he sees in places like Hungary, Poland, even the UK and US more recently.
What makes for a good elite, in his view?
Fundamentally, trustworthiness and truthfulness.
Yeah.
Liberal democracy depends on citizens being able to trust those in charge. When elites are corrupt or constantly dishonest, it shreds the social fabric. He uses a very cynical Hunter S. Thompson quote to illustrate the danger.
Which about?
In a closed society where everybody's guilty, the only crime is getting caught. In a world of thieves, the only final sin is stupidity. That kind of cynicism is toxic for democracy.
So elites need competence, yes, but also
Wisdom. A sense of responsibility for the whole society, for the republic. They need to be exemplars, showing honesty, restraint, appealing to our better instincts, not our worst fears and hatreds.
So wrapping it all up, the core problem Wolf identifies is the need to find a new, stable balance between the market and democracy.
A new equilibrium, yeah, because the current one isn't holding.
And renewing citizenship is key to that.
Central. But he's careful about what that means. It's not about ignoring foreigners or becoming purely protectionist or thinking your gain has to be someone else's loss.
It's more about
Valuing your fellow citizens. Recognizing the importance of the shared political community that allows for collective action, mutual support, the welfare state. That sense of shared fate.
So based on everything Wolf lays out, the future really hinges on choices.
It seems so. Choices by citizens and leaders. Choosing serious reform over just letting things drift further towards breakdown. Choosing to prioritize the common good.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a pretty challenging thought to chew on. Given these huge global problems, Wolf mentions climate, pandemics, great power rivalry that seem to scream for more international cooperation, and at the same time, this urgent need he describes to strengthen democracy within nations by demanding better from our own leaders and institutions.
Yeah.
How do you see that tension playing out? How do we balance strengthening our own democratic communities with tackling the global challenges that require us to work together?